I'm Dr. Joe Ross. I'm a professor of genetics, and this coming semester, I'm going to be teaching a class in human genetics. And as part of that class, some of my students are going to be allowed and given the opportunity to take an ancestry test to understand and learn about how ancestry testing is completed and to be able to get their own DNA sequence information and learn how to analyze and interpret it, again, as part of a class. So the purpose of this recording is to give a brief introduction to some information students and consumers might want to know about ancestry testing in the United States before you decide whether or not to do ancestry testing. So today I'm particularly going to briefly go over the terms of service and privacy policy of one commercial ancestry testing company, FamilyTreeDNA. And I also want to note that today is December 29th, 2023. So as I walk through their website today, note that in the future, their terms and conditions, their privacy policy, and the look of the website might be different. Now, before using any commercial ancestry test, including in the United States, you have to agree again to the privacy policy and the terms of service. And so I'm just going to point out some highlights. You should definitely read the privacy policy and terms of service of any ancestry testing company in full before you decide to use their service. Now, a brief background before we get into the terms of service and privacy policy about what genetic testing is. So the process, generally speaking, is you spit saliva into a small tube, or you take a cheek swab using a Q-tip or something like that, to collect a few cells from your body, and you send those to the ancestry testing company. And the ancestry testing company will extract your DNA from your cells and then read the nucleotide sequences at different parts of your chromosomes to give you information about your ancestry and also potentially some information about disease or health risks or traits. Now, the service provides these data as well as estimates of things like where you might have come from in the world based on your DNA sequence. You also get the opportunity to download the raw DNA sequence data from the company, and that's one of the things that I'm going to help students use in class. These companies also then give you the opportunity, you're not required to, but you have the option of making your ancestry testing information available to others that use the same service for the purpose of things like identifying relatives, individuals in the world that share a lot of the same DNA sequences as you do, which makes them likely to be, for example, first cousins or second cousins. Okay. So let's move on and take a look at their health website, their help website, excuse me. So this is, again, for FamilyTreeDNA. I'm not an employee of FamilyTreeDNA. I don't own any stock in FamilyDNA. I don't have any conflicts of interest. This is just the company that I chose to purchase DNA test kits from for the purpose of use in my university level human genetics class. So first thing, our DNA process and storage. Let's learn a little bit about what they do with your samples once you send them in. So note that they say here that they give you 2 tubes or vials, one for each cheek, meaning what you do is you, for FamilyTreeDNA, send them 2 different samples. And what happens is they extract the DNA from one of the samples, and important to note that the sequence and the DNA that they extract are stored at their company for future tests that you might want to order. The second vial with your other cheek cells is secured for room temperature for up to 25 years. And they say here that they use this only in case the DNA sample from the first sample that you sent them doesn't work well when they try to extract the DNA or when they try to read the DNA sequence information. If something fails, they use the second tube that you've sent them as a backup. Okay. So one thing to think about is, are you comfortable with this scenario? Are you comfortable with the genetic testing company, in this case FamilyTreeDNA, storing your biological materials for up to 25 years? We'll talk a little bit later about what you can do to control that process. So we protect your privacy and DNA. So how is your privacy protected at this company? So they mentioned that they store all of these data securely. And also note that the samples aren't stored or saved or associated with your name in particular. They're associated with a barcode that's attached to the samples that you send back. They also note that they don't send your information with any third parties. They don't provide your DNA sequence to many third parties. You'll have to read their privacy statement we'll cover in just a minute to learn a little bit more about this. But note, and this is something that's come up a lot recently in society, they might share some of your personal information, which could just be your name, email, phone number, or could include your genetic information if there's a valid subpoena or court order from law enforcement to compel FamilyTreeDNA to turn your information over to a third party, law enforcement in this case. So your DNA belongs to you further explains that their policy is they will never share your DNA with third parties. They definitely won't share your information with insurance agencies. There used to be an issue with pre-existing conditions, and maybe if somebody would get your DNA sequence information and learn something about your health, like maybe you have a mutation that makes you susceptible to a certain disease, and if an insurance company got that information, maybe they would deny you health insurance. That's no longer allowed after the 2008 GINA Act in the United States. But it's really important to note here, the last line in this section, all of your information is held on secure servers at the company behind your own personal sign information. So you have your username and password for your account, and nobody else at FamilyTreeDNA has access to your data unless you choose to share it, with a few exceptions in the privacy policy that we'll cover in just a minute. Okay, so the privacy policy, again, we'll talk about later. But sample access and transfer. This is kind of interesting. They will not return your samples to you. So once you ship your samples to FamilyTreeDNA, they won't send them back for any reason, even if you ask. But they will destroy your samples if you want to. So you have a process by which you can contact their customer support team and ask that your DNA that's extracted from a sample, or the original sample itself, the swab of your cheek that's stored at room temperature for up to 25 years, you can ask them to destroy those samples, and they will do that. And lastly, before we get to those two most important policies here, who can purchase and take a test? You have to be at least 18 years of age. Okay. That's the most important part. You also have to be legally allowed in wherever you live to purchase a consumer testing kit from a commercial company like FamilyTreeDNA. Some countries and some areas of the world actually don't allow individuals to purchase commercially available Ancestry testing kits. So you have to be over 18 and you have to be legally able to purchase their kit in order to use their kit. So at this point, we've looked at some of the before you buy nomenclature and boilerplate language from the FamilyTreeDNA website. And the next thing we're going to do is to look specifically at the privacy policy and the terms of service briefly, give just some highlights. Again, you should read these documents in more detail and make a decision about whether or not you want to use FamilyTreeDNA to do genetic testing or any other company that you might choose to use. So let's go ahead and take a look at the terms of service. So again, they mention that you have to be of an age to be able to use their service. You have to be at least 18 years of age. So eligibility to use the services must be 18. And then here are some really important parts. So please pay attention if you haven't been yet. This is really important when deciding whether to use an ancestry test. So this is basically FamilyTreeDNA trying to give some informed consent to warn individuals about some of the potential risks of using ancestry testing. So first, you may discover information about yourself that you did not anticipate. And they list some examples, and there are all great examples in the news recently of these sorts of things actually happening. So this is not hypothetical, this can actually happen. You could find out that if you're in a different part of the world than you thought. You could discover an unknown relative, again, if you choose to share your information with other people that use the same genetic testing company to make matches between potential relatives. That could be, for example, that you discover that you're not actually the child of your parents. And there's some, again, great recent news stories about these sorts of things happening when somebody takes an ancestry test and discovers a match, and the ancestry testing company suggests that the match to the consumer is a parent, like a father or a mother. And it turns out that the child was an illegitimate child, born out of wedlock, or maybe they're adopted and they didn't know they were adopted. And then they discovered that they have a birth parent that is not either of their, what they thought were their natural parents. And then also health conditions. So you may discover something about your health, disease risk, and so forth as part of this process. Other things to consider: that this is a scientific process, and so there are potential errors. So FamilyTreeDNA and other genetic testing companies as well do a really good job of quality control, but they can't guarantee that every piece of data they send you about your DNA is 100% accurate. Mistakes can rarely happen in the scientific method. And they also mention things like there could be inadvertent misidentification of samples, even though they use a barcoding process to track your sample and attach it to your account. There could be mistakes that get made. So the whole point of this section of the terms of service is to realize that this is not 100% accurate. It might be 99.9% accurate, but you shouldn't make decisions about your life based on the information that you get from ancestry testing. Likewise, they mention, again, genetics is an evolving field of research, and what we know now as scientists and geneticists about human DNA sequences, we know some now, but we will learn new things later in the future. And those things could add new information that you could get if you ask FamilyTreeDNA, for example, to reanalyze your sample and get new information that you could use. But the other thing that could happen is that future research might contradict what we think we know now about specific mutations and how they affect human traits or human diseases. So current knowledge isn't absolute, and you need to be aware of that when you start considering how you interpret and how you trust or believe in the conclusions that are being reached through the analysis of your DNA sequence that gives you information about things like ancestry. So some legalese, things that may or not be relevant, but you should be aware of, that you're using this information for research, educational, or informational use only, that you're not using this information for actual medical diagnosis. Again, because there are errors, potentially rare, but you shouldn't stake life decisions on the data that you get from these sorts of tests. You should always consult a doctor or physician. One other thing that they say here is that you don't get any benefits from any development of new products that FamilyTreeDNA or any other ancestry testing company might develop based on your information. So again, they won't use your information, give it to other people, other companies, sell it to third parties, but they might use your DNA data anonymously as part of their huge database of human DNA sequences to do research and to develop additional services and to market them. And again, you note that your DNA sample can't be returned to you, and they will store one sample for at least 25 years unless, again, you tell them to destroy that sample. That you are at least 18 years of age. And interestingly, although I think when we go down the rest of this document, you may start to think about some reasons why these policies exist. You're guaranteeing that the sample you submit when you spit in the tube is your sample, that you're not stealing somebody else's DNA and claiming it as your own just to get DNA sequence information from somebody else. That's wildly unethical, of course, and against the terms of use for this company. Likewise, you're guaranteeing, this is very similar, that you're not an employer or insurance company trying to get DNA sequence information from somebody else. And that your DNA sequence data might, it's at some point, not guaranteed, be used by law enforcement for very specific purposes. In this case, FamilyTreeDNA says they will only allow law enforcement access to your DNA sequence information in particular cases, which is homicide, sexual assault, or child abduction. And there's a long process for law enforcement getting access to that data, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Likewise, you agree not to use FamilyTreeDNA to do any criminal investigations, forensic examinations, and so forth. And then there's some other, again, when I read this, I think something obviously happened to make them add this to the policy. That you agree not to post content that's illegal, threatening, harmful, abusive, or otherwise objectionable, defamatory, libelous, obscene. One of the reasons for this is that you can leave comments on your page and you can share stories on your FamilyTreeDNA web page that's associated with your account. And you can imagine, I suspect that somebody, a bad actor, could use FamilyTreeDNA and their genetic information to stalk, harass, or threaten individuals, post information or communication you know is untrue or misleading, that you are not impersonating anybody or falsifying your affiliation with anybody. So there's some really detailed things in here. Again, you should read the entire document. So that's the end. We're not going to cover group projects because we are not participating in the group project in the class that I am leading. So that's all I wanted to talk about, the terms of service. And now we're going to turn to look at the privacy policy again at FamilyTreeDNA. So let's speed through that privacy policy. And again, you can take a look in more detail at this later if you want to. All of these web pages are available from FamilyTreeDNA's help site. So here's the privacy statement. This is information about what information FamilyTreeDNA will collect from you and how they will share it and use it and how you can control its release. So types of information they collect. They collect personal information such as information you provide when you register for an account, like your name, phone number, etc. Payment information. For the students in my class, you won't need payment information because I've already purchased the genetic testing kits. They will collect information about your DNA. Okay. And they collect profile information. So if you choose to post things like your photograph, your name, your sex, where you live, and so forth, that's information that would be collected and stored by the company. And any other information you choose to provide, that's voluntary on your part. So other information they collect, web behavior information, information about your mobile device. You should read that. So how does FamilyTreeDNA use that information they collect from you? So they can do things like they need to be able to process payments. So they'll need payment information for people that are paying for services. They need to be able to process and deliver your genetic testing results. They will use research and development. So again, I mentioned a few minutes ago the possibility that they anonymously combine your DNA sequence information with everybody else who uses their service for the purpose of validating new analyses or doing some research on human genetics. But that's something that your data could be used for. Again, that would be anonymously. We already talked about law enforcement, and they may be served with subpoenas, for example, in which they would be compelled to divulge information about users of FamilyTreeDNA. So how do they use your information? Well, we already talked about the fact that you can opt in. You don't have to do this. You can opt into matches. That would, again, be comparing your DNA sequence with the DNA sequence of other people who use the same service to try to identify siblings, cousins, second cousins, aunts, uncles, great-grandparents, and so forth. You can also purchase, although this is not part of the Ancestry testing package, you can purchase additional services from most Ancestry testing companies to look about traits, health and wellness, as they say here. So you can get ethnicity results from the data. That's also part of the uses of the genetic information from these services. So let's take a look about where they share your information. So you can choose who gets your information. They will never, they say in this document, they will never share your personal information without your consent, meaning they don't sell your personal information, contact information, and especially your DNA information, unless you choose to let them share it, or unless you take the DNA sequence yourself and post it on the internet or share it with somebody else outside of the FamilyTreeDNA website. So other users that you choose to share your information with, definitely. That's an opt-in. You don't have to do that, but you can opt in if you want to. They need to share your information, contact, payment information, for example, with other businesses that are owned by the same company that runs FamilyTreeDNA. Not surprisingly, service providers, for example, the people that process payments, the shipping companies that deliver the tests, and so forth, all have access to some of your information, but not the DNA information, perhaps phone number, email address, and so forth that you use to set up your account. And again, legal and regulatory purposes. So for example, again, if they have to comply with a legal process, then they will do that. But they mention lower, and also in the law enforcement guidelines page, that FamilyTreeDNA will do everything in their power, unless it's illegal, to contact you if they have been forced to turn over your genetic information to law enforcement. Okay, so you'll at least be told, right? That's at the bottom of this section, that if they have to disclose your personal information, they'll do their best, unless they are prevented by law enforcement from telling you, to tell you that they have disclosed your personal information to law enforcement. Now, here's another opt-in or opt-out, that there's this investigative genetic genealogy matching part of the FamilyTreeDNA service that is used by law enforcement, again, to do things like identify the remains of deceased individuals or perpetrators of either homicides or sexual assaults, but not other sorts of crimes. And law enforcement has to jump through a lot of hoops through the FamilyTreeDNA's process to get access to this information. But here's a really important note, again, before you sign up for this service, that users will only be viewable to law enforcement if you've done all of these things. If you have opted into matching, that's one of the 4 steps that was required for law enforcement to be able to have access to your information. Then note the next part, which is probably the other most important part, that you have not opted out of investigative genetic genealogy matching. In other words, when you sign up for the service, you will be able to say, I opt out of having my information included in this database, the IGGM, Investigative Genetic Genealogy Matching database. So if you do not opt into matching, and if you do actively opt out of IGGM, then your data won't be able to be used by law enforcement. So it says here, if you opt out, law enforcement accounts will not be able to see you as a match or view personal information viewable by matches. Although, then, do note, if you decline to participate in that process, they may still be required to share your information. Again, that would be if law enforcement has a subpoena or other compelling evidence that they need your specific genetic information. FamilyTreeDNA may still be compelled to turn that over to law enforcement. And finally, access. So you control your account of FamilyTreeDNA with your username and password. You can, if you want to, although this is probably not something that most of you will need to worry about, you can assign a beneficiary. That would be somebody who, if you die, or when you die, they would have access to your username and password and be able to access your account after your death. So you can do that if you want to. You don't have to do that. And also that you can have FamilyTreeDNA destroy all of your data. So down here, how to delete your personal information. You can get rid of your personal information, close your account, for example, and also how to delete your genetic information. Again, you tell the company through their customer service link, and they will delete all of your genetic information. You can also, as I mentioned earlier, ask them to destroy the biological samples, not just the computational data, the A's, T's, G's, and C's that make up your DNA sequence, but the samples themselves, also by contacting customer service. And let's see if there's anything else in this giant document that I wanted to cover. Nope, not at the moment. So there are a couple other bits of the FamilyTreeDNA website that I want to cover really briefly, and then we'll wrap up. So going back to the FamilyTreeDNA's Help Center, this is the term and policies part. I want to take a look at matching consent. This is the part where you agree to let other users at the FamilyTreeDNA website be able to contact you if FamilyTreeDNA's algorithms determine that you are likely a relative of somebody else who's a user of the FamilyTreeDNA service. So this is, again, opt-in. You don't have to do this. There are many reasons not to participate in matching. I mentioned a few of them earlier that were part of the terms of service. Things like, what if you discover that you have a relative that you didn't know about, maybe you don't want to know about, maybe you discover that you're adopted, or that one of your parents isn't your actual biological parent, that you were born out of wedlock or something like that. If you opt in, then you can learn certain things like how you're related to people. Other individuals that are FamilyTreeDNA users could view your name, email, picture, limited DNA sequence information. This is not your A's, T's, G's, and C's that make up your DNA, but analyses by FamilyTreeDNA of your genetic history. And then potential ancestors, surnames, your stories, if you post any to your account, your country of residence, and any family trees that you've developed as part of their service. So that is part of the matching consent. So they can't, other users, if you do match somebody else on FamilyTreeDNA, can't get your DNA sequence information. They can access, this information that you've posted by yourself of your own volition to the FamilyTreeDNA website. And finally, let's take a look at the law enforcement guide. I just want to show you this really quickly. It's more dry than all of the other documents that we've looked at so far. And I've already talked about a couple of these points, but I just want to show you that FamilyTreeDNA has this policy for law enforcement that outlines exactly how law enforcement has to go about asking for access to your data if they want it. So again, they will only allow law enforcement to access personally identifiable information, DNA sequences, and contact information, and so forth, for the purpose of identifying the relatives potentially of dead individuals, or to identify perpetrators of specific types of crimes, homicides, sexual assaults, and abductions. And what they need to do is provide a lot of paperwork to the company that runs FamilyTreeDNA, genebygene.com, about their agency, jurisdiction, who the investigator's contact firm is, and what their contact information is, case number, case circumstances, and so on. So law enforcement, has to go through a lot of steps, and they have to have very specific and actionable data that they need to access specific information about specific users. But still, remember that you have the option to opt out of some of these abilities for law enforcement to access general data about lots and lots of users at the same time. If you think you're going to perpetrate one of these very specific and very heinous crimes, you probably should not do ancestry testing and put your DNA sequence information in this database. That's the bottom line. So to wrap up, thanks for watching this introduction to the FamilyTreeDNA process. Again, my name is Dr. Ross. I am not at all affiliated with FamilyTreeDNA. The purpose for this recording was to walk through FamilyTreeDNA's terms of service and privacy policy, because I have chosen to use their test kits as part of a human genetics class that I'm instructing in the near future. And this is an introductory video mainly for my students, although for anybody who's interested in commercial and genetic testing companies. If you're going to do that, I just wanted to give you some ideas about things that you need to pay attention to in those documents before you agree to use the service, right? Hopefully this was helpful, and pay attention to some future videos that I'm going to have developed about what we do as we go through the Ancestry testing process. Thanks for watching.